my name's Mr. McQuire and I want to welcome you to this lesson where we will be looking at the structure of plants and flowers. This is the first lesson in a group of lessons entitled The Power of Plants, and we will be looking at not only the structure but also words like pollination, water transport and photosynthesis. So before we start, try and find somewhere that's nice and quiet to work and away from distractions, and you will need a pen, a pencil, even some colouring pencils or felt tips even if you have some available where you are, and you will also need some paper to write on. So pause the presentation at this point if you need to go and collect those. So our learning outcomes for today, the challenge is to be able to describe the roles of different structures in a plant. Obviously that implies that we should know what the structures are called, so we will revise those. And then the aspire, we're going to develop that to be able to compare and contrast the structures of different plants, but that will build into our next lesson on pollination when we combine a little bit of form, what it looks like, with function, how something works. So let's look at some Key Stage 2 revision first. In front of you, you have a box at the top of the page which contains some words. At the bottom of the page, you have a picture. Two pictures I should add. First of all, you have a flower on this side left of the page, but over here, rather different in size, is a tree, just so that we're clear about what they are. So what I would like you to do is to spend a minute and a half now just seeing if you can work out which labels you would apply to each of those boxes. I don't want you to put anything down on paper yet, just see if you can fit those words in particular boxes so we can check vocabulary before we start trying to build on work for Key Stage 3. So a minute and a half, away you go. If you finish that, just see if you know the function of any of those parts. Okay, let's have a look at those. So, starting on the top left, you'll notice that they have not included the whole of this organ, which is called a flower. They're just pointing at the petal part of it, tissue within the organ. Then we've got an organ called a leaf. Then we've got an organ called a stem. And then we have another organ called a root. Now you may be familiar with organs in humans, for example the heart and the lungs, but plants also have organs, and there's a few examples for you to think about. Hopefully the labels were not a problem. Now on a tree, of course, things are on a slightly different scale and slightly different vocabulary that we use. Leaf is shared and roots are shared, but then we have branches interconnecting with the trunk, that's labelled on that diagram. Okay, that's key stage 2, and that's work that we should be familiar with. Just have a look through them again, pause the presentation if you need a bit of time to rehearse any of those labels. So on your piece of paper, at the top of the page, can you please put the main title, which is The Power of Plants? And then underneath that, if you leave a line, and then put the title for today's lesson, which is Structures of Plants and Flowers. I'll give you a minute to do that. So the main title at the top of the page, The Power of Plants, misaligned, and then underneath that, today's lesson, which is entitled Structures of Plants and Flowers. Okay, make sure you've underlined those, keep them nice and tidy, and let's move on. So the first points that we would like to make about plants and flowers is they have many features that are common, and yet at times we find it very difficult to spot those common features. Why could that be? Well, of course, the answer to that is that just as in the case of animals, plants and flowers come in lots of different sizes and shapes, and in lots of different adaptations to allow them to do particular functions. So let's just broaden the idea slightly about exactly what plants can look like and go on a bit of a world trip. So let's have a look at some of these amazing plants and animals on our planet. So let's start with big. Okay, this is a Canadian redwood or sequoia tree found in parts of Western Canada, but also America, and these trees are literally colossal. They can be well over 1,000 years old, and we've managed to leave them alone, interestingly, because the wood is not very good for use in timber for construction. It's very fibrous, so they have remained untouched by people and are now a treasured part of life on this planet. They even are so big that they have caves in the top, and they take several hours to climb. If they're not big, of course, they can be incredibly small, but they contain features that are shared between them. Some of them are adapted to live in very hot places, and you may, from Key Stage 2, be saying, oh, it's a cactus. Can you remember some of the adaptations that go with those particular places where they live? What are those red things, for example? The thing in question here is not the small child sat on that, but some plants live in very wet places. So in a way that the cactus was not adapted, what doesn't this plant need to struggle for? And again, it has features that are shared between the two. Some of them are adapted to live in particular places in a very different way. And here's a plant that obviously uses a mobile phone. That would just be there to give you a size of the plant. It's quite big, isn't it? And they smell like rotting flesh to attract particular nutrients, he said politely, from animals that fall into places and die, and when they rot down provide nutrients for the plant. Here's a particular plant. They look like they bleed dragon's blood. Well, I'm not sure that we know what dragon's blood looks like, but again, they have very particular shape and structure that's adapted to live in a very particular volcanic landscape in this case. So by the time we finish this lesson, it would be good to be able to look at this lovely picture of a couple of plants here, and be able to actually say what the parts are that are on there, so that you can impress your parents on Mother's Day, for example, and be able to go through the different parts of those. Now, if you were in a lesson, we may spend quite a long time doing a flower dissection, where we would get tweezers and get a fresh flower, and we would actually pull the parts and lay them out to construct our own flower that we could press and put into an exercise book. Of course, we don't get that opportunity today, but maybe you have flowers in the house or in the garden that after this lesson you could look at and try and label the parts. That would be a great piece of practice. So under the title that we've already put down, we need to try and replace that activity with a little bit of drawing. So at the top of this lesson, I said that you would need a pencil. So if you could please take about half the page and just construct the diagram that you see in front of you, just to make it clear that half of the petals have been pulled off that would be in a dish around here inside these green bits here that we're going to learn about. So we're looking effectively at a plant that's had parts of it removed, but I've chosen a very simple diagram to allow you to make a reasonable copy in a couple of minutes. If you have finished quickly, then by all means get some colours out and just give it a shade in to make it look great in your notes, and stop the presentation if you use the 2 minutes up and would still like to continue with that. Okay, I hope you jumped appropriately when that went off and you enjoyed the music. So let's have a look at the diagram. Let's talk about your page for a second. Main title, Power of Plants. Subtitle, Structure. Then underneath that we have this beautiful diagram that you have drawn in my mind, and what we're going to do now is use this diagram to learn the parts. Now, I want to make it clear that, of course, flowers come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. So on the next page is another picture of a flower that is labeled that's slightly different from yours, but it has the same features. Okay, now you're going to have to pull labels away from different parts of this diagram as you label them. So what I would say is you will need a ruler before we move on to the next picture, because it's going to look slightly more complicated, and I would like you to have some very accurate labels well spread out around your diagram, because we're going to add even more detail. This diagram is critical to your understanding in the lesson. Okay, so we have then a flower very similar to your own, but what's happened is that we've just changed the structure slightly. So starting very simply, let's first of all get a ruler and let's put on a label for petal. At the top of this section here, this is the female part of a plant, we have three labels starting from the top. We have the stigma, we have the style, and then we have the ovary. I've learnt those three in a kind of a learning three: stigma, style, and ovary. Okay, SSO. Just get used to running those through, because that's the female part of a plant, and we're going to start talking about words like seeds and pollination from there. Let's talk about the male part of a plant, and you may be going, what? They have male and female parts? Yes, they do. So we have an anther. Okay, if you've ever brushed against those on certainly on a pile of lilies, for example, or a bunch of lilies that you've been bought or had in the house, you get pollen on your clothes from those, and that anther is sat on top of this long spindly thing, which is called a filament. Now underneath we have these green parts. Before a flower opens, I think we would call it a bud, wouldn't we? Well, it's wrapped up in this green covering that protects it, and that particular green covering sounds a bit like petal, and it's called a sepal. Okay, so on your diagram, I am going to give you plenty of time for this, and I'll play some music when we've got 30 seconds left. I'm going to give you now 5 minutes, I think, to allow you to draw lovely lines with a ruler, please, so that they're accurately on, and you can then label those individual parts. Please spread them out around the diagram, because we're going to be adding detail to each of those labels. Off you go. Okay, we're coming up on 2.5 minutes. If you have already labelled them because you are super speedy, then try putting your hand over the labels and see if you can recall the words that are under your hand. Just try that on both sides of the diagram. See what you can do with those. We've still got about 3 minutes left. Okay, just 30 seconds left. Let's get all the labels on. Okay, now before I go on to the next slide, you will need a pen in your hand, and we are going to do some very concentrated revision preparation work on the diagram you have in front of you. So we need to be able to describe for the challenge the role and different structures in a plant. So we'd better learn the labels and also have some kind of an idea of the role of those particular parts of a plant. So let's start with a slightly easier one, petals. Okay, so petals are obviously rather colourful parts of a plant. So next to the word petal, okay, could you please put the word colour and the word insect? So what I've done is I have looked at the bullet points that are there, and I have seen the colours that we see in a flower petal are quite different to those seen by insects. Okay, so I'm just going to summarise all of that in 2 words, and hopefully you can see what I've done there, because I'd like you to have a go at the next one. So petals, colour and insects. Okay, let's try the next label and see what you could pick up. I'll give you 10 seconds to try and get ahead of me while we're busy looking. Okay, so let's look at the next word. First of all, this is about the stigma. It's kind of a landing pad on the top of the female part of the plant. See if you can find it on yours. You've got the style and then the ovary down at the bottom. Let's look at its function then. So the stigma receives the pollen from visiting insects. Okay, now I'm going to be slightly controversial here and say that it doesn't just receive pollen from visiting insects, it receives pollen which could be blown by the wind as well. So my 2 most important words, and maybe you thought the same, is actually receives and pollen. So just 2 words to go with the word stigma. Let's look at the rest of that female structure though while we're here. Okay, Here's a little piece of information. It is one of the female parts of a flower, and the others are the style and the ovary. So on your diagram, could you put a small star next to the stigma label, the star label, and the ovary label, and then put a small key under the diagram with the same star and just write the word female. So those are the female parts of a flower: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Okay, pause if you need to, remember. Let's try another label. So let's talk about the ovary for a second. So the ovary down here is down at the base of the flower. Okay. The three female parts of the flower are all together called the carpel. So here's our information. We've now got a star next to stigma, style, and ovary with the word female. Next to the word female, can you please write the word carpel, because all three of those labels together are collectively called the carpel. Now here's our associated word with the word ovary. So the word ovary, in the ovary, is the development of immature seeds to make seeds, ovules that become seeds. So next to the word ovary on your diagram, could you please write the word seeds? So once they're fertilized, seeds develop there. Okay, we've heard about the female parts of a plant, and I'll quickly say stigma, style, and ovary, and all together called the carpel. Now let's find out about the male parts of a plant. So if you can go to your label of anther. So here's our piece of information. The anther is one of the male parts of a flower. Okay, the size and shape of the anther will attract the correct insects. That's a nice piece of information. I wonder what happens in the anther. The anther and the filament together, they are called the stamen, and importantly, they are the place where pollen is made. So we need, in the same way we've labeled the female part of the plant, could you put another symbol next to the word filament, maybe a triangle or a square or something small that you can now use as a key, and next to the word anther as well over here, and can you, underneath your diagram, they are called the stamen, those two together. The important information, however, that we need to go with the word anther is the word pollen. So that's where pollen is made in a plant. Okay, so on your diagram then, we have labeled the petals, we have the carpels, which are the stigma, the style, and the ovary. They are the female parts of the plant. We have the male parts of the plant, which are the anther and the filament, and those two together are known as the stamens, and they make pollen. Okay, the sepals are down at the bottom on the diagram if you watch the pointer that I'm currently using, and as I've said already, they really are important before the flower opens, because they wrap up, if you look in the background, the flower and protect it while it's busy developing inside there. So let's just look at the information for a second. The sepal is usually green. That's to do with a process called photosynthesis that we'll learn about. It's start of the flower that protects the bud. So my word that goes with sepals, or my words are protects the bud. Okay, so if you could write next to the word sepal, protects the bud. Okay, let's just have a recap for a second. Just look at your page. At the top of the page, we've got a main title, Power of Plants, and then underneath that our subtitle, and then a diagram. We've labeled the diagram around. It's a good half-page diagram, and then next to each part of the diagram we have got a label, but also some idea of the function or the parts, whether it's male or female, and something connected with that, some information. Okay, if you need to pause and go back over this section, just rewind the presentation. Okay, so let's quickly now do a bit of application of the learning that we've done in today's lesson. We're going to have a game of true or false. Okay, so I'm going to run through these quickly. First of all, the petal puts off insects approaching the flower. Is that true or is it false? Let's see what you can remember. Just counting to 5 in my head. 2, 1. And the answer to that is that it's false. Of course, the petal is attracting specific insects to a flower. Let's try another one. Is pollen the male or sex cell? True or false? Is pollen the male sex cell? 5, 3. And that, of course, is true, because pollen is made by the male parts of the plant, the stamen, and it is the male gamete or sex cell. Okay, let's try again. The stamen is the male reproductive part of the plant. Is that true or is it false? 5 seconds. 2 and a 1. So the stamen is the male reproductive part of the plant, so we should be saying that it's true. Let's try another one. The ovary is a male reproductive part. Is that true or is it false? Hopefully you're sitting there thinking, well, that's straightforward. 5, 3, 1. And of course it's the female part of the plant, so that must be false. So does the filament produce pollen? True or false? Does the filament produce pollen? That is false, and of course the answer is the anther. So let's try this one. The carpel is the female reproductive part of the plant. Is that true or false? Have a look at your diagram. It's got the stigma, the style, and the ovary in it. Is the carpel, the overall name, is it the female reproductive part of the plant? 3, 2, 1. True. It is the female part of the plant. Okay, thank you for joining me in today's lesson. We have today been looking and describing the roles of different structures in a plant. So we should be able to look at the parts of a plant, but then specifically to be able to look at the flower on a plant, and we have talked about different structures in different parts of plants, and of course we'll be developing this idea as we look in our next lessons at pollination, and also after that looking at water transport, and we get more and more detail from here. So thanks again for staying with this presentation today. Please rewind and listen to parts of it again if you need to do some review. Thank you. Bye bye.